After the release of Metal Gear, Hideo Kojima was satisfied with his work and moved on to his next project. He actually had no plans to develop a sequel to Metal Gear, that is, until he was catching up with a coworker of his who had been assigned to the Snake's Revenge project, with their talks about the game giving Kojima the inspiration to create his own sequel to the original game. And thus, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake was born and ultimately released just 3 months after Snake's Revenge. So how did Kojima and his team go about improving upon the foundations laid by the original Metal Gear, and how does it hold up today? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the third in a series of videos where I'm playing every Metal Gear game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the first couple videos in order to enjoy this one, you'll be missing a lot of important context about my journey with those games if you haven't seen them. So I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake is an action-adventure stealth game developed and published by Konami for the MSX2 in 1990. And something to mention here that I didn't in the Snake's Revenge video is that while that game was released exclusively in North America and Europe, Kojima's Metal Gear 2 was actually released exclusively in Japan. That means that in the early 90s, the sequel that you would have gotten to the original game was completely dependent on where you lived at the time. That being said, I should reiterate that since this game is the sequel made by Kojima himself, this is the canon sequel going forward, with Snake's Revenge existing in its own separate continuity. And with that being said, I should mention that for the sake of this video, I played the original Japanese release for the MSX with a fan translation patched in order to get the closest experience to that original release as possible. So while they were incredibly rare during my playthrough, if you ever see some weird grammar issues in the dialogue throughout the video, know that that's not because of the developer's work. Rather, it's just a side effect of a team of fans putting this together in their free time just so that native English speakers could play the original release. But getting into the game itself, the new emphasis on cinematic presentation is immediately noticeable, with the game starting up with roughly 5 minutes of cutscenes before the gameplay even starts. And that might sound like nothing nowadays, but for an 8-bit computer game in the early 90s, that's pretty unusual, with the story of most games from that era still just being there to give the player a reason to be where they are, doing what they are, and really not much outside of that. So to give you the basic setup, the game takes place in 1998, and it's told to us that a major oil crisis is affecting the global economy, with petrol deposits running out faster than estimated. In an effort to counter the problem, Dr. Kyo Marv engineers a new species of algae called oilix that can produce petroleum with little expense or effort. However, Dr. Marv is kidnapped by soldiers from Zanzibar Land, a newly established military state in Central Asia. We're also told during the intro of the game that Zanzibar Land's soldiers had raided the nuclear storage facilities of every world power that held them, leading to Zanzibar Land being the only nuclear power in the world. NATO discovers that Zanzibar Land's leaders plan to hold the world hostage by controlling the supply of oil through oilix while defending themselves with the stolen nukes, so Foxhound's new commander, Roy Campbell, sends Solid Snake to Zanzibar Land in order to rescue Dr. Marv. And thankfully, Snake is sent in with some new tech to play with as well. This leading right into the first improvement over the previous game's design with the addition of the mobile radar. This is a minimap that is displayed in the top right-hand corner of the screen that allows you to see the movement of enemies on not just your screen tile, but also all 8 of them surrounding you. This allows players to move much more carefully between screens and ensures that careful players will never be spotted immediately when entering a new screen. And in the event that you are spotted, you're no longer forced into combat in order to re-enter stealth. Instead, you can now run away from enemies that can see you and find a place to hide until the alert dies down. Along with that, Snake can now crawl along the ground as well as under certain objects in the environment, meaning that players have a lot more options when it comes to avoiding alerts. And while the combat itself didn't get any better in this game than in the previous 2, the fact that it can be avoided completely outside of boss fights or story moments definitely helps a lot with making the game feel a lot better to play. But that's not where the improvements to the stealth and game feel end here. In Metal Gear 2, enemies can finally see more than just what's in their direct line of sight, with the design team giving them a 45-degree vision cone instead. This means that it's much easier for enemies to spot you and leads to a much more believable stealth experience than what was found in the first couple of games. On top of that, different floors and surfaces make certain amounts of noise, allowing enemies to hear your movement and become suspicious even before you enter their direct line of sight. As well as that, item farming is gone now. Kind of. See, you can no longer leave a room and re-enter it to farm up a full inventory of healing items or ammo, but that doesn't mean that it isn't possible to take the time to farm them. In Metal Gear 2, when you enter a new area of the game, such as a different floor of a building or different buildings themselves, you'll get one of these loading screens. And whenever you get one of these loading screens, all of the items in the game will respawn and be available to pick up again. So if you really wanted to farm healing items, you still could, although it's worth mentioning that it doesn't feel like it's as necessary this time around, as the game seems to be balanced around the assumption that players won't go out of their way to farm them this time. Something else that is still present but slightly changed is keycard swapping. Unfortunately, the team decided to maintain the keycard system from the previous 2 games, making nearly no changes, but there is one change that I find very strange. As you progress through the game, alongside the numbered keycards, you'll be granted access to these colored ones that essentially condense 3 keycards into just one. The red card can unlock doors levels 1 through 3, the blue card opens doors 4 through 6, you get the idea. This tells me that the team 100% knew that swapping between cards to unlock doors was annoying, and put these new items in to reward players with some quality of life features throughout the game. But since there are still 3 separate colored cards in the game, swapping through your cards is never completely gone, it's just reduced. I find it bizarre that they would go out of their way to make something to improve the system without just outright fixing it, especially since the functionality of having a single card open multiple levels is literally in the game now. But I guess it's just part of Kojima's vision. Speaking of Kojima's vision, something that's reverted back to how it was in the original game is the codec. Rather than keeping the change from Snake's Revenge, where the player is simply given a contacts list, players once again need to either memorize or write down the different frequencies to call their allies on. And like I said in the Snake's Revenge video, I like that Kojima respects the player's intelligence enough to ask them to remember these, but I also didn't mind the convenience factor of having everyone on speed dial in that game. So this isn't really a positive or a negative for me, just something that I thought was worth mentioning. But one major change from the previous games that I loved was how they went about the class ranks in this game. In the last 2, your rank would always be displayed on screen, and you would rank up after rescuing a certain amount of hostages, meaning that your exploration would be rewarded with more health and carrying capacity. But here in Metal Gear 2, the rank is no longer displayed on your screen, and the team changed it so that you would rank up after defeating the bosses of the game rather than rescuing hostages. This makes it much easier for the designers to balance the game around the player's rank, since at any point in the story, they'll know exactly what your maximum health and carrying capacity will be. It also makes it much more rewarding as a player to defeat the bosses of this game, so in my opinion, this is a fantastic change. And while I'm on the topic, the boss fights of Metal Gear 2 are easily the best in the series so far. Granted, that's not the highest bar to clear, but these are definitely a step up nonetheless. The gimmicks they each have are much more interesting than those in the last 2 games, and they also have much more depth and intrigue as characters thanks to this game's stronger emphasis on the storytelling. Each boss in this game gets a much longer introduction, as well as all of them either getting conversations with Snake or monologues after they're defeated, in order to better flesh out their personalities and their backstories. The bosses here are much more enjoyable and memorable than in the first couple games, and I hope to only see them continue to improve from here. One weird quirk in this game though is that soft locks are occasionally possible thanks to the bosses. Some of them are placed right after a loading screen, which places a checkpoint for the player to load back to on death, meaning that if you die during the fight, you'll just load back into the beginning of the fight. And I personally had an instance during my playthrough where during my exploration, I wandered into a boss fight that gives you a checkpoint upon entering, but I hadn't yet found the item I needed to defeat this boss. So I ended up needing to load my last manual save to get out of it, losing a decent bit of progress. I'm assuming these instances were simply oversights by the design team, but I wanted to be sure that I mentioned it here since it can be really awful for the player experience. But since I've already started talking about exploration a bit, let's go over the general flow of the game. During the early portions of the game, the exploration feels better than it ever has before. The team did an amazing job keeping things varied, with you going from sneaking around the facility, to trailing a specific guard through the jungle, to finding a hidden road to cross a swamp. Things are just constantly changing up, and it's really easy to play for hours at a time. But as the game goes on, more and more of that obscure bullshit from the first couple games starts to creep in. Things like being told that you need to find a woman in disguise as a guard, and the solution being hiding behind a plant for a little over a minute, waiting for a guard to walk into the women's restroom. That, or the fake wall secrets that of course make a return from the first couple games. Unlike Metal Gear 1 though, these secrets are not tutorialized to the player well here. When the player is introduced to the concept, they're told that one of Snake's allies is being held in a cell in the basement of one of the buildings. When you go down to where you were told the cell would be, there's a child here that tells you they've moved the woman to another building. But despite this, your ally is actually being held exactly where you were told they would be. It's just that she's in a secret cell hidden behind a wall in the room you were directed to in the first place. There's nothing in the game to tell you to blow up the wall, you're just expected to not believe the child and to search this room thoroughly anyway, even going as far as to punch the walls to find a spot where the sound effect for hitting it sounds a little different from the others. Even for someone like me, having played all these games in order so far, this was not straightforward at all, and I wouldn't have found it if I hadn't given up and Googled the solution. But at the very least, once we do find her, we do get this hilarious romance scene as a reward. But the secrets in general are just part of a larger problem that still remains in Metal Gear 2. That late 80s padding. And for the most part, this problem hasn't really changed from the first two games. However, one aspect of it has gotten so much worse. The backtracking. And look, I should preface this by saying that I don't typically mind backtracking in games. I was raised on old school survival horror games, and I've been a big fan of Metroidvanias for a long time as well. I understand the value of backtracking when it's done properly. However, Metal Gear 2, in my opinion, does not do it properly. This game will have you backtracking to the start of the game constantly. You make a little bit of progress, and then you walk back to the first floor of the first building. You get whatever was there that you couldn't get before, walk back to the newer areas to continue making progress, hit a milestone, backtrack to the first floor of the first building. And I shit you not, this continues all the way into the final area of the game, where in order to progress, you will need to backtrack, you guessed it, to the first floor of the first building. The amount of time that I spent walking back and forth from where I was actually making progress through the game and the starting area of the game is actually insane, and I doubt I would even want to know how much of my time was wasted doing this over the course of my entire 10-hour playthrough. But let's finally talk about what everyone's really here for when it comes to the Metal Gear games. The story. I already gave the basic setup earlier, and after Snake infiltrates Zanzibar Land, we find the cell Dr. Marv is being held in, except in classic Metal Gear fashion, it's not actually Dr. Marv. It's revealed that it's actually a new enemy known as Black Ninja, and a boss fight ensues. After defeating him, he reveals that he is actually Kyle Schneider, one of the resistance fighters that we worked with back in Metal Gear 1. Schneider explains to Snake that he joined up with Zanzibar Land because after the events of the original game, NATO launched a bombing campaign against Outer Heaven, leveling what was left of the nation's forces, but also killing innocent women, children, and resistance fighters en masse. He then tells us of a man who came in after the bombings and rounded up survivors to give them a new home and purpose in Zanzibar Land, then quickly tells us how to find the real Dr. Marv before dying. So Snake goes and finds the guard that Schneider told him to follow and is led to a shack out in the jungle. When he enters, there's nothing inside, but there's a tapping sound coming from the other side of the wall. Campbell calls Snake, mentioning that he might be using tap codes, a real method of communication used by prisoners of war during the Vietnam War. And in the game's manual is a guide on how to decode the tap codes, leading to you being able to get 5 numbers, with these numbers then making up the codec frequency that you can call the doctor on. After entering the frequency, we get on call with Dr. Petrovich Madnar, also returning from the original game. Madnar explains that he and Marv knew each other from the academy and were captured during a trip to America before being brought to Zanzibar Land. He then asks Snake why he thinks they've kept him alive so long when they only needed Dr. Marv to begin with, before revealing to us that he's been kept around to assist in the development of a new Metal Gear, Metal Gear D. He also drops the bombshell that the man Schneider was telling us about earlier is in fact Big Boss, who is still somehow alive after the events of the first game. Moving on, we eventually find a way to contact Dr. Marv via codec, but he only speaks Czech. So in an attempt to translate what he's saying, we seek out Natasha Markova, an STB agent who is undercover as a guard in Zanzibar land, who just so happened to be fluent in Czech. We eventually find her by following her into the ladies' bathroom, very classy by the way, and she talks to Dr. Marv, who tells her that he is being held in the detention center north of where the two of you are, as well as mentioning that he's worried about Dr. Madnar. So Snake and Natasha go through some underground tunnels, reuniting with Madnar and taking him with us as well. The three of us eventually get to a bridge where Madnar crosses first, and then as Natasha is crossing, the bridge suddenly gets hit by a rocket, sending her flying and killing her, as well as separating us from Dr. Madnar, who is captured again. This all happening just before Metal Gear D gets rolled out, and it's revealed that it is being piloted by none other than Gray Fox, our fellow Foxhound agent who we were sent in to rescue in the first game. He simply warns us to leave and walks away, not wanting to kill Snake if he doesn't have to due to the fact that they were colleagues for so long. Snake finds a way across the destroyed bridge, into the detention camp, and eventually into Dr. Marv's cell. When we get there, Marv is already dead, and Madnar is being held in the same cell with him. Madnar tells us not to panic though, because his Oilix plans can still be recovered as they're hidden on an old MSX cartridge made by Konami, which he mentions that some die-hard game fans still use to this day. Very cheeky fourth wall break. We then receive a call from Holly, a CIA agent who's undercover in Zanzibar land, warning us that she had the agency run a check on Madnar and that he was in fact a double agent for Zanzibar land and is not a prisoner of theirs. He admits to Snake that he just wanted to complete his work on Metal Gear after he destroyed the original model, before accusing Snake of having the key to the locker holding Marv's cartridge and jumping on his back in an attempt to choke him out. Snake uses whatever he can to get Madnar off of him before Campbell calls us and tells us that a brooch Natasha gave us while she was dying was actually the key to the locker. Snake uses it to unlock the locker, revealing a crawl space with the MSX cartridge hidden inside. As we leave, Madnar speaks up one last time, telling us that he will never let you go. Snake ignores him and leaves before Gray Fox appears in Metal Gear D. Luckily for Snake though, the new Metal Gear has the same weakness as the previous one with the legs being too lightly armored, so we destroy it with some grenades before the explosion of it sets us on fire and Gray Fox manages to escape. The fire burns all of Snake's gear, but that doesn't stop him from chasing Gray Fox into a room where he tells Snake that he's been looking forward to finally getting a good fight in with him for a while. We get a codec call from one of our allies telling us that Gray Fox started to develop a hatred for America after he had a relationship with a woman from the East who applied for citizenship in the US and got denied for it. It's then revealed that that woman just so happened to be Natasha Markova, the woman who Gray Fox killed earlier that day. Snake and Fox have a fistfight before eventually Fox goes down, saying that it's finally time for him to give up the title of Fox. He explains that when he was a child, Big Boss saved him from a war-torn nation, saying that he was born into a battlefield and thus is unable to return to a normal life, wishing to die on the battlefield as well. Fox passes away and Snake is called into the next room by an unseen voice. And here we find Big Boss ready to confront us. He explains that ever since he first experienced war, he has been completely unable to return to civilian life. He only feels alive when he's on the battlefield, he craves war, and thus he created both Outer Heaven and Zanzibar Land to not just give a purpose to himself, but to soldiers across the world. Snake then explains that he doesn't fight for the sake of fighting and that he actually hates war, and that he's only here to rid himself of the nightmares that he's been having since the Outer Heaven incident. Big Boss continues on with his monologue before telling us that he will free us from our agony, and a battle ensues. Snake, having no gear, runs around frantically scavenging whatever he can from the environment while Big Boss stalks him with his rifle. Eventually, Snake manages to collect both a lighter and a spray can, putting the two together to create a homemade flamethrower and using it to set Big Boss on fire, killing him for good this time. Snake then reunites with Holly, the CIA agent from earlier, and the two of them call for a helicopter pickup before escaping from Zanzibar land. We then get a brief epilogue where Campbell and Snake confirm that the cartridge he recovered has the Oilix plans on it, and Campbell asks if Snake will continue to work for Foxhound going forward. Snake tells him that now that he's finally gotten rid of Big Boss, his nightmares have stopped and he has no reason to fight anymore, effectively retiring from being a soldier. The story here is shockingly strong for its time. The first game had a decent story, but nothing all that deep or complex, and Snake's Revenge had some story, but this is something entirely different. Keep in mind that everything I just went over was heavily abridged for the sake of time, and there are still so many subplot elements and character backgrounds and even characters themselves that I didn't mention at all. This would be a good story for a game by today's standards, and the fact that it was pulled off in a game from 1990 is incredibly impressive. Overall, I enjoyed my time with Metal Gear 2, but it was a bit of a mixed bag. The game design has improved a lot from the original game, but unfortunately, a lot of the decisions that made that game so annoying to play at times were still present here. The story was a major step up though, and if this is what Kojima and his team were capable of while stuck in the 8-bit era, then man, I can't wait to see what comes next. But at the end of the day, I'm going to give Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake a 7.4. But what do you guys think? Those of you that have played the game, those of you learning about it for the first time through this video, let me know in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, anything to let me and the algorithm know that you did enjoy. It helps me out a lot, so I'd really appreciate it. And if you're interested in supporting the channel financially, consider checking out becoming a channel member or a patron. They start as low as $1 a month and can get you things like behind the scenes updates, early video access, and more. YouTube and its ad revenue systems can be really inconsistent at times, so everyone who contributes even just a little bit really goes a long way in making this possible and making it a lot less scary to do full time. And hey, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't seen them already, then you definitely enjoy the rest of my Metal Gear videos, and maybe even another series I recently started doing the exact same thing with the Ace Combat games. So if you're interested, I'll have both of those linked right here on screen.